Well, way back in September of 1995, the last time the UFC was here in Buffalo, there were hardly any rules in this sport. Something tells me earlier this morning, UFC officials were secretly wishing that we were fighting back in those days because my oh my, what a morning it was here in Buffalo. We will talk about that in a second, but first, let me introduce our historic panel. Yes, we are making history today on the MMA Fighting Preview Show. Of course, I am Ariel Helwani. That is John Pollock of the Fight Network, and that is Aaron Bronsteter of TSN. What do we all have in common? We're all Canadian. This is the first time in the history of our preview shows that 3 Canadians are doing this. This is very exciting. I've never been more excited. There's a lot to talk about with these gentlemen. Let's start with Aaron. Aaron, you were there this morning. It was quite the scene. In my opinion, it's going to be hard to top what we witnessed this morning. The drama was at an all-time high. It was theater at its finest. We had Daniel Cormier show up. He weighed in at 206.2 pounds. Distraught. Walks back, head down, almost in tears. And then he reemerges 2 minutes later and weighs in at 205 pounds. And then after that, at the buzzer, Anthony Johnson weighs in under 205 pounds. And then we find out that Pearl Gonzalez was out of her fight, but we'll get to that in a second. First, describe the mood, the vibe in that room when first Daniel didn't make weight and went to the back.
Well, I said to UFC VP of Regulatory Affairs about 10 minutes before that happened, Mark Ratner, we should have some sort of shot clock, like a countdown clock with a buzzer at the end to build the suspense. And he looked at me and he said, I think we've got just about enough suspense. Yeah, and that just about said it all. So, with 5 minutes left, if there's one guy in the main event that hasn't weighed in, there's a little bit of drama. Both guys, unprecedented. And it was crazy to see. When Daniel came out for the second time, I thought he forgot like a pair of socks or something. Right. Then suddenly he gets on the scale, they yell out 205, and okay, he's good to go. I was shocked. You and I both spoke afterwards saying I didn't realize you could weigh in a second time, because with these new early weigh-ins, from what I understood, you couldn't. And I guess according to the New York State Athletic Commission, that's not the case.
Yeah, it's all very loosey-goosey. We're going from state to state. There are different rules. And John, from what I understand, Daniel didn't know that he could reweigh in. Do you feel like it is on the commission, it is on the UFC, it is on the fighters to educate themselves? When you're coming into a jurisdiction, if you will, a state, and there's clearly a rule in their guidelines that for a title fight, you get an extra 2 hours if you fail to make weight, shouldn't people know that?
Yes, and I think you can really throw the blame around to numerous places here. I thought it was appropriate that this was the weight class because this topped the weigh-ins at 205, which I constantly was thinking about today. And that was another case where Donald Cerrone comes in so early, weighed in, and had he waited, that fight could have been saved if they had been able to work a catch weight, but the weight was such a far discrepancy, and we were all there at Madison Square Garden or across the street at the time for the weigh-ins, and we're not aware of this rule. So the fighters, of course, they need to be researching this and learning about different jurisdictions, because what happens in Nevada doesn't necessarily apply in New York. I think that the UFC, they have to be educating these fighters, and I think the commission has to be open in communicating this, because it just seems to be a mountain of confusion, and I feel for the fighters that they have enough on their plate, and a lot of assumptions are made when you're going to a new state, and sometimes those assumptions turn out to be invalid, as we saw this morning, because Cormier could have had an extra 2 hours without that concern that you had to make it by this certain time.
Right. And of course, when Cormier reemerged, he steps on the scale, and there has been a lot of talk about him sort of holding on to the towel in front of him. And people have now gone online and tested this out for themselves, that if you do kind of put a little bit of weight on something, you can actually lose a pound or two. So perhaps this explains why he lost that 1.2 pounds in essentially 2 minutes time. How do you feel about this? Because on the one hand, we talk about weight cutting all the time. It is archaic, it is dangerous, it is life and career threatening. So here's a guy who kind of maybe found a loophole and is now good to go. The fight is on. We're getting to see what we came here to see. Do you feel that way, or do you feel like, wait a second, there's clearly something that happened there and they should look into this?
Well, I'll just say that the optics are very unfortunate. When we were in the scrum with Daniel earlier, he said he had no idea about the 2-hour rule, and he just desperately wanted to get back out there and make weight. So he got out there, made the weight, but in the way he did it, holding onto the towel, and when I pressed the New York State Athletic Commission's executive director about it, he kind of said, oh, well, I didn't realize that, and that was the last we heard of it, right. In terms of the towel. But knowing that he could have had another 2 hours, I'm pretty confident he could have made 205 without any complications, just going by these rules. So again, the optics are very unfortunate, and I guess we'll never know how it would have played out had he known that he had 2 hours to make the weight.
Does the towel thing bother you at all? People are all up in arms, and I know in this day and age we're looking always for something to criticize or complain about. How do you feel about it?
Listen, to the best of my knowledge, the three of us, I mean, we didn't come up as wrestlers, so I can't say definitively how effective this is to Daniel Cormier. But the fact is that I think that the scrutiny is valid in all of this. We can assume that, hey, he would have had two more hours to make this weight. But we don't know that definitively. We don't say 2 hours before a weight cut that a guy, he's close enough, let's just rubber stamp him. You do have to make that weight, especially in a championship fight. I think the least that could have been done was that when this was brought to their attention, I mean, there was denial he was even touching the towel. That to me screams of just, we don't want to poke this around. We don't want to lose a championship fight. I think that that's kind of the conclusion a lot of people made. So I think that if there's scrutiny that comes Daniel's way, I think some of it is valid when you hear a Jon Jones, who does have a history with wrestling, talking about this being a tactic that is utilized to make weight. When Anthony Johnson is laughing about this, and I mean, he himself had not heard of this, but realized that it's a bit of a trick to use. So I think that there's going to be some scrutiny here for fans and for people that came here. Of course, they want to see this championship fight. But if I'm a fighter that's ever been docked pay in the past for not making weight or losing a championship fight, that has happened. Of course, you would be upset here seeing that, you know, maybe I could have skirted the issue and been able to make weight.
I will say this. I have never heard from more current and or former fighters about a weigh-in incident than today. People texting me coming out of the woodwork saying, did you see the towel? Did you look? Did you see? I've done that before. I've tried to do that. Everyone weighing in. Some don't like it. Some appreciated it. I think in the words of the late Eddie Guerrero, what was it? If you're not
cheating, you're not trying.
Maybe that applies.
What was the sentiment from fighters, though? I mean, were they acknowledging that this is,
they acknowledged
101?
that this can help. Some of them were like, man, DC, you're a sly veteran. Others said, hey, look at the towel. No one, I think, was upset or kind of bothered by it, but a lot of them were just very quick to say to me, hey, did you see that? That actually works. Something actually happened there. Also, I mean, I think it's personally, you know, it could have been a valid excuse. This is a guy who was clearly dehydrated. He was clearly out of sorts. I mean, you saw him when he walked up to the scale. He could have been a little out of it, maybe needed that time. Who knows? I think he played it the way he had to play it. Don't address it. The commission isn't making a big deal about it. The UFC isn't making a big deal about it. So let's move on. And to add to all of this drama, we have Jon Jones here in Buffalo, former resident of Endicott, New York. He grew up in this vicinity, Western New York, and Daniel Cormier has been talking about him a lot. He's been asked about him a lot, and he said that Jones should be embarrassed. He shouldn't be here. He's under suspension. Jones threw a couple jabs his way and said that that was the dirtiest tactic he has ever seen in sports. What do you make of his presence being here? Does this kind of add to your interest in the fight, or do you agree with DC that he shouldn't be here because he's under suspension?
Listen, I don't know if it was the UFC's call or if Jones, it was him initiating coming here. I think it was brilliant, the fact that he was put here. He has added to me such just a different layer to this title fight, knowing that Jon Jones is going to be their cage side. I think it would have been brilliant if they did a reverse of 197 and it's Jones on commentary watching this fight unfold, because I think it's pretty clear Jones is the next in line. I don't think that anyone is kind of looking at a warm-up fight for Jon Jones. I think the fact he is here and so focused upon that is going to be the public's demand, is Johnson or Cormier fighting Jon Jones. So I think it was a really smart touch to have Jon Jones here and adding a lot of intrigue to the outcome of this fight.
So they met once back at UFC 187. Cormier submitted Rumble. He's very confident going into this fight. Says once a quitter, always a quitter. Does he get the job done on Saturday night, or will we see a new champion?
I think Cormier does get the job done. Cormier is such a smart, cerebral fighter. His technique is unbelievable. His chin, it's never failed him. Again, getting up there at age. And that's really the thing that I think separates this fight from the last fight, is that it's 2 years removed. Rumble has been clearing through guys. I think he's taken out 4 of the top 5 guys in a combined 9 minutes and 30 seconds. I'm not sure if that's 100% what the exact stat is, but something along those lines. He just, people used to compare Ronda to Mike Tyson. Anthony Johnson, to me, is doing what Mike Tyson used to do. He gets in there and he's scary, like you're expecting a knockout in the first round. I think that if Cormier does get out of that first round like he did last time, that he should be able to dispatch of Johnson for a second time.
What do you think? Who are you leaning towards?
This has been a really close fight. I'm going with Anthony Johnson, and I think that this is a fight that it's all in how much of the first fight do we see here. I think Daniel Cormier being 36 for that fight, 38 now, that's a big gap for a fighter in age. Anthony Johnson has looked fantastic in the 3 fights since. I feel the longer this fight goes, you have to revert to Daniel Cormier and that conditioning. But with Anthony Johnson, I always put a lot of stock in rematches when it's the guy that was somewhat outclassed in that first fight and came so close to finishing him in that first round. That's the guy that has had to rewatch that fight, that has been asked about that fight, that has prepared going to the gym with that visual. With Daniel Cormier, this was a test he passed with flying colors, and he is older now. And with Anthony Johnson, I just feel that he definitely has the tools that he showcased in that first round to do to Daniel Cormier that few, really just Jon Jones, have been able to do in this sport. So I think that if this is a fight that Anthony Johnson, the first 2 rounds, I think favor Johnson. Once we get past that, then I think it becomes a bigger issue towards the conditioning and cardio of Anthony Johnson if he can expand that to 25 minutes. But my pick's Anthony Johnson.
Wow. All right. So we are split for the main event. I think the co-main event is equally as fascinating, and for a couple reasons. First, let's start with Gegard Mousasi. All week long, leading up to this fight, he's talking about show me the money. We've never quite seen this side of him. He's open, he's unfiltered. This is the end of his UFC contract, and he says, yes, I'd love to fight for a belt, but I want to get paid more. Do you feel like he is putting too much pressure on himself going into this fight?
I don't think so. I think Mousasi is usually pretty cool and collected for the most part. I do like that he's gone from robotic Mousasi to opinionated Mousasi. And I think, when we spoke to him in the scrum, he said, Donald Trump's the president. I want to be the president. I'm going to start talking because I want to make my opinions heard. And that's how you get what you want in the sport. So it seems like he's learning how to play that game. I mean, he's had 50 fights. He knows how to play the game inside the cage. Now he's learning to do it outside the cage. And I'm really enjoying the new Gegard Mousasi, the unhinged Gegard Mousasi. Yeah. And given his relationship with Scott Coker, there's always the possibility of going to Bellator. Although this week he also did mention he was interested in fighting in the Netherlands for the UFC down the road. So it seems like that's the direction he's leaning in. But as he said, show me the money.
Yeah, former Strikeforce champion. He's won 4 in a row, 4 impressive victories. If he wins this fight against a Weidman, where do you put him in terms of, the free agents that we've seen over the past year or so? Do you think that Bellator will aggressively go after him? And let's not forget, Bellator has a pretty weak middleweight division. I mean, sure. Witness the fact that tomorrow they're having a rematch of maybe one of their worst fights ever for the middleweight title.
Yeah, this is such a interesting, like these top 2 fights are where the lion's share of the interest should be and are. With Gegard Mousasi, like here you are fighting a former champion in Chris Weidman, a very, very difficult fight, and yet with a victory, he'd be in a really nice position free agency-wise, but within that UFC middleweight division, it's so clogged right now where it just feels like all of these valid middleweights, they're all just looking for seats in the waiting room, and we know Yoel Romero's waiting with the number 1 to be called, and we don't know when that call's coming for him. So these middleweights are just kind of in place at the moment. For Chris Weidman, it is must win. At the same time, a win, he's no further ahead. I don't think either guy for such a taxing and difficult fight for both men necessarily are going to reap the rewards in the UFC. On the free agency market, though, Gegard Mousasi is someone I feel Bellator would aggressively go after. This is a tremendous fighter, first and foremost, but he has really come out of his shell over this last year to 18 months. That just seems someone that is just tailor-made for that Bellator marketing team to just have a field day with. And you look at their expansion overseas. He is someone they can really hang their hat on as someone that they can take into a lot of different markets. On top of that, with a win, Gegard Mousasi is in a really nice position, and one that if UFC is not aggressive in retaining him, I think that speaks volumes. If this is not a Ryan Bader, Gegard Mousasi is someone that if the UFC does not move heaven and earth to retain, I think that's pretty telling in and of itself of where their aggressiveness is when it comes to retaining talent.
Aaron, when this fight was first announced, a lot of people, a lot of media members, including myself, openly questioned whether it was a smart move for Chris Weidman. You lose 2 fights in a row. You lost the belt against Rockhold. You lost against Romero, and they were brutal losses, brutal finishes. Maybe take a fight against, a guy who's in the 15 to 20 range, work your way back up, get your confidence going. He didn't want that. He's very confident, told a great story this week about almost moving back into his parents' basement, watching Rocky III, having this sort of epiphany, wow, my life has changed. I'm now living in this mansion and I need to go back to the basics. But he didn't want to do that. And just talking to him multiple times, his confidence is at an all-time high. But, actions speak louder than words, so we'll see what happens on Saturday. Do you feel like this is a little too tricky for him? Like, in hindsight, he probably should have, taken a 15 to 20 ranked guy as opposed to a guy who's on a roll like Mousasi?
Absolutely not. Weidman looked great in the first round against Romero, looked great in the first round against Rockhold. I think that he's one of the most talented guys in the UFC, not just in the division. He's a guy that can do everything really well. Good striker, very good grappler, and I think that that's what he needs to go back to for this fight. He needs to get back to his grappling roots, try to get top control over Mousasi. That's where I think he'll have his best success in this fight. It's also a 3-round fight, which I think helps him a lot. I know the Yoel Romero fight was a 3-round fight as well, but I think that if he is able to put it all together, I don't think that Mousasi is going to be that big of a threat to him. I know Mousasi is a very talented guy. I just think the world of Weidman, and I think that those last 2 losses were huge hiccups that happened during the fight, mistakes that he made that he's looking to correct. As you mentioned, he's now in his bat cave in his house and keeping it dark and going back to his roots. He got a new dog,
yes.
And his wife didn't want him to get the dog unless he took care of the dog. He had to send the dog to a trainer to get trained so that he didn't have to spend all the time with the dog so he could focus on the fight. He's also reading a lot of books and refused to tell me which books he was reading because it's very personal, very private. So after the fight, if he wins, I will ask him what books he's been reading to get to where he had to be to beat Mousasi. But I think he has to keep fighting the top guys if he wants to stay on top of the division. Obviously, he's got his sights set on the title, and the best way to get back to the title is to beat top guys, and Mousasi's a top guy.
So does that mean you're leaning towards Weidman?
Absolutely.
Finish or decision?
I think he'll win by decision.
How about you?
I love this. We, as Canadians, we are just disagreeing here. I'm going with Gegard Mousasi. Listen, this is another fight that it's very close to call. I think with Chris Weidman, it just seems like there is this belief that, after 2 losses like that in a division as loaded as middleweight, at times you'll get really conservative performances because the win is of the utmost importance. It is pretty hard to fathom this guy losing 3 straight. You can make some comparisons, not exact comparisons, to Holly Holm. 2 fighters that ended long-standing win streaks, and then they're in really tough fights, tough divisions, and suddenly Holly Holm's lost 3 straight. Chris Weidman, you lose 3 straight at middleweight, that is really tough to turn around. And with Gegard Mousasi, he's someone that you almost think he's too loose during fight week, but I'll take that any day over somebody that is coming off such a tough knockout loss to Yoel Romero that I don't think we put as much stock into the way in which he was finished against Yoel Romero, and that was only back in November, and you're coming back against a killer in Gegard Mousasi. So I feel that Chris Weidman, certainly you want to see his wrestling be a really effective tool in this fight. I think that if it is Chris Weidman that comes in with a clear mindset and not so focused on just making sure against anything that his arm is raised, that's the best Chris Weidman possible. But just looking at the variables here, I really like Gegard Mousasi in this fight.
And fascinating that Mousasi is predicting that Weidman won't take him down once. So that is obviously an interesting thing to look out for on Saturday night. So Cormier, Rumble, their weigh-in wasn't the only weird commission-related fiasco, if you will, this morning. We had Cynthia Calvillo weigh in without incident, but then her opponent, Pearl Gonzalez, was one of the last to weigh in. She makes weight, and then moments later we find out that the commission had informed her that she will not be allowed to compete on the card because she has breast implants. And we found out that in fact, in their guidelines, it does state that a quote-unquote boxer cannot compete with breast implants because they are afraid of potential injuries that could come as a result of this. And this was percolating for the entire afternoon. We didn't know. Then we started to find out that they were trying to save the fight. They asked her doctor for medical information. The commission did. And right before the ceremonial weigh-in, we find out via Dana White that the fight is back on, that they saved the fight. And credit to her, I think she showed up and met with the press just moments ago, spoke to us about it, and I thought handled it like a pro, especially for someone making her UFC debut. What do you make of this entire situation? Could it have been handled better?
Well, absolutely, it could have been handled better. Again, this is one of those things where the fighter should probably have that information going into a fight.
And by the way, worth noting, she claims she actually put it on her medical form, so it's not like she was just, kind of hiding this or keeping it to herself, not disclosing it.
Right, it was disclosed. And I actually saw in an article that was published like a month or two ago or some time ago that it was mentioned. So I don't know if I didn't know that she had disclosed that and that they didn't just discover this.
Yeah.
But it's a strange rule, and it's a rule that applied to boxing. If you posted the actual guideline that says boxer, so I'm not sure how relevant it is in the MMA realm. It's nothing like that has happened before. Obviously, if it did happen, it would this world would probably explode in terms of this space. Sure. But yeah, I think they probably could have handled it better. I'm really glad that she came out and did the press conference. I think that was probably very cleansing for her to get that off her chest, no pun intended, and tell the media that this is a very personal matter. It was probably very hurtful to her and very scary for her to think that she'd come all this way on short notice, took this fight, and then was out. So I'm glad that this is behind her and that she can go back to focusing on the fight. That said, Cynthia Calvillo had a very good performance at the last pay-per-view. Back-to-back main cards for her. I think they're trying to give her a push, part of Team Alpha Male. So, I think her back's up against the wall here a little bit, and she'll have to prove her mettle tomorrow.
An unfortunate situation. I mean, you really feel for Gonzalez. You also feel for Calvillo, who for a second thought the fight was off. Kind of feel like they embarrassed Pearl Gonzalez a little bit. Quite frankly, I think Miesha Tate was embarrassed today. A lot of people talking about Miesha Tate, who had nothing to do with this story, and because she fought in New York, and I think that was completely inappropriate as well. And then I think Dana White coming out and saying, "Oh, don't believe any of these stories. The fight is on," and then her coming out and saying, "I was told the fight was off." I just feel every step of the way. And then even when I asked the commission about it, they said, "We're not going to talk about it." This feels like it was handled really, really poorly. I mean, this, in terms of all the commission-related things we've seen over the years, just blows my mind that it actually even became a thing, and that they waited till after she weighed in to inform her that the fight was off when she disclosed this information. How does this happen?
That's a great question, Ariel. I don't know how this happens, how it happens so late in the week. I'm curious where did the light go off for the commission that realized this? Like, what was it that led to them suddenly realizing this about Pearl Gonzalez, and for her to have to go through all of fight week, and she is conceivably interacting with these commission members throughout the week with UFC officials, and never is this raised. And then all of a sudden, Friday, right after weigh-ins, she's informed of this. And you're right, Cynthia Calvillo, for not just a second, for a number of hours, this fight was up in the air. Am I fighting tomorrow? Am I putting back weight? Am I just completely throwing out this weekend as one of which I'm fighting? This was a disaster, I think, from all sides. And to me, it comes down to something really simple, and that's curious that I would love to see the form that these fighters, when they are apply for a license, did this say straight up, have you ever had breast augmentation? Yes, no, because that's pretty much the clearest language you should have, as opposed to anything of this gray area. And the fact she stated she disclosed it just adds more of a series of questions that comes out of this. I think it was a really trying day, and thankfully at the end of it, both women have a fight on Saturday, but a lot of stress incurred, I would say, on both women as a result of this that could have been easily negated from square one when it came to applying for a license in the state, and both sides just being on the same page.
And they should also probably explain why they feel like this is a danger or a potential detriment to a fighter, why they would not allow a fighter, because it doesn't sound, at least for now, that they're going to change the rule. They say they got the medical information and they cleared her, but why was that rule in there to begin with?
Well, yeah, it would be, I would love to have that explanation. I can say on professional wrestling, like, that has happened with women before, where they have either had an implant leak or even explode. So, I mean, there is a discussion to be had there. I don't think this is one of those wacky rules that just is pulled out of nowhere that seems archaic. I'm sure that there is some science behind this being included, but that should have been explained. That rule should be explained to the fighters and publicly, I think, coming out of this.
I know Gonzalez is relatively unknown. Calvillo just one fight in the UFC. Who's your pick in the fight? I'll put you on the spot.
I do like Cynthia Calvillo in this fight. I mean, Pearl Gonzalez, it's been a year since she last fought. I think that you look at this, I mean, Cynthia Calvillo is certainly being marketed as someone that they can really promote and get behind, and that's what this fight feels like. With Pearl Gonzalez, though, she's coming in, with, I think, lower expectations from a lot of people in terms of how she'll perform. I don't think anyone looked at 209 as Cynthia Calvillo would be this remarkable performance would be a result from it. So, there's some pressure there on Calvillo, so I think that makes it intriguing as well. The fact that Pearl Gonzalez is making her UFC debut on a pay-per-view main card, and that Calvillo was kind of she was one of the many stories of 209, but not really focused upon going into that fight. So my pick's Calvillo. I think that she's a very talented fighter and has, been very busy in 2017 already. So I think that's going to be a positive for her. And also having that ability to have one UFC fight under your belt, I think that helps a lot, especially against a debuting fighter like Pearl Gonzalez in the UFC.
Your pick?
We're going to agree on something here, John. Finally. Well, I think Cynthia Calvillo just has everything going for her in this fight. She didn't have to worry that much about the distraction earlier today. It wasn't really on her, even though she wasn't exactly sure whether or not she would be fighting. The sample size for me is tough. I don't know that much about Pearl Gonzalez fighting-wise. I do know that in her life, she has overcome a lot. She comes from a broken home in Chicago, really came from nothing, and has big aspirations to be a superstar. She really looks up to Ronda Rousey and that model of success. So if she's able to overcome what she's overcome in her life, I'm not going to count her out against Cynthia Calvillo. That said, I was really impressed with Calvillo at UFC 209, and I think she holds the cards in this one.
All right. Running out of time here, so let me get some quick picks for the rest of the main card. We've got a fellow Canadian, a fellow Montrealer, Patrick Cote, going up against Thiago Alves, who is returning to 170. Who is your pick?
I don't think we're going to disagree on this one either as Canadians. I'm going with my favorite RDS analyst,
Yes.
Patrick the Predator Cote.
You got to go with the colleague.
Same Christmas party. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Let's keep it in the family. Patrick has looked great. I know he lost to Donald Cerrone, but I think that was a pretty big step up in competition for him at 170. Before that, he was looking pretty unstoppable for a time. Alves missed weight at 155 at the last event. Didn't look very good. And since he's come back from a pretty long layoff, I haven't been overly impressed with what I've seen. A lot of people have said it's the USADA era. I don't want to put that on a fighter, but I will say that I think that Patrick Cote is the better fighter right now, and will probably win this fight.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I really don't have, I don't work in the same company as Patrick Cote, so I say this completely unbiased. I just think Patrick Cote, you look at the skill set in particular of the last 3 years of what he's built upon, adding to his wrestling, and I think figuring out the striking of Thiago Alves, who's just been a real wild card, whether it's been at welterweight and the inactivity or the failed experiment of going down to 155. Thiago Alves is always that fighter that you look at that, wow, he could come out and just blitz the doors off of someone, because we've seen him fight at that kind of a level, but it's been very inconsistent. And I just think that Patrick Cote, he's such a smarter fighter than the one that we saw 10 years ago. This is his 21st fight in the UFC, which is a remarkable feat, and how he's evolved. 37 at this point. I'm sure he's looking at kind of the back end of his career, but he has, I think it was also a big plus for him taking that time off after the Donald Cerrone fight, not just jumping into another fight. So I feel that might go the distance in this particular fight, but I like Patrick Cote.
And then finally, the former Bellator lightweight champion Will Brooks against Charles Oliveira. Your pick?
Yeah, I think this is a sleeper fight on the card. Two notable names here. I'm so happy that Charles Oliveira is back at 155, because if you were a Charles Oliveira fan, this guy disappointed you a lot at 145. And when you look at the losses, though, Max Holloway, Anthony Pettis, Ricardo Lamas, coupled with the weight problems, he was fighting top-end guys, and this was just not a featherweight, and that was the struggle for him. It was the weight more so than just the opponent that he had. So I like him being at 155. Will Brooks, I almost throw the Alex Oliveira fight out the window, because that was such a ridiculous set of circumstances that here's a guy that comes in overweight, and then I think that was a big factor in that fight. So this is kind of, with Will Brooks, I think a fresh start for him after 2 fights that have not really set the world on fire within the UFC's lightweight division. But I'm leaning Charles Oliveira in this fight, just because I feel that if this weight cut was a significantly stress-free one as compared to featherweight, I think we're going to see the best of this guy, who's still young in this game, despite how many years we've been watching him compete. I think when he can put everything together, this is one of the top-tier fighters at 155. Has the potential to be. It's not that late for him.
Your pick?
Well, I think it was a pretty easy weight cut. He weighed in at 152.8. I don't think he cut any weight. I think that's what he walks around at, to be honest, with Oliveira. I'm actually going to agree with John here. I think that Oliveira's a dangerous fighter. He pushes the pace on the feet. He is fine getting taken down because he's so good off of his back. Will Brooks is a pretty sizable favorite in this fight. He's a guy that's beaten Michael Chandler, has an incredible resume. But Oliveira is just such a tricky guy for someone with Will Brooks' skill set. Matchups make fights. I think that Oliveira has potentially an advantage even on the feet. His striking has looked better and better. And then if it goes to the wrestling and Will Brooks takes him down, he's going to put himself into hot lava, as your colleague Robin Black calls it, when someone takes someone down and they're just so active off of their back. And that's what Oliveira's MO is. So I'm going to agree with John on this one and think that Charles Oliveira is going to get the job done here.
All right. Great stuff, guys. Phenomenal
all
work.
Canadian. Look at that.
A lot of fans were saying there weren't enough Canadians on this card. We're just around 99 miles from Toronto.
Yeah, they're all covering it.
You get 3 Canadians doing the preview show, and I think they did a phenomenal job. Once again, that's John Pollock of the Fight Network. That is Aaron Bronsteter of TSN. Check out their coverage online leading up to this card. And, of course, thank you so much for watching our coverage up until this point. We will be back over at MMAfighting.com for all our usual fight night coverage, post-fight coverage as well. But for now, we will say goodbye. The UFC is back in Buffalo for the first time since UFC 7, September 1995. They return tomorrow night, officially April 8th, for UFC 210. Should be a great night. We'll see you on Saturday.